But this replacement of fresh food that comes directly from nature in exchange for the convenience of processed and preserved food that has been altered or manufactured is only part of the problem. The more significant part of the problem in our food choices that has led to this dramatic increase in obesity, diabetes, and many other health problems has occurred at what I call the red line. The red line represents a specific time frame from the late 1970s to early 1980s in which there was a bigger change in the dietary recommendations for the people in the United States. These recommendations extended to many other countries around the world and has contributed to this epidemic of overweight and obesity that now extends to many countries around the world and all the health problems associated with being overweight and obese. So what happened in the late 70s to early 1980s? As reflected in the March 1984 Time magazine cover, there was a big change in the type of diet that was being recommended by the government agencies to the American people. It was recommended that the American population should be eating a diet low in fat in order to prevent heart disease and other cardiovascular problems. This loss of fat in the diet was then to be replaced with more carbohydrates to provide the energy that we need. And this change in dietary recommendation resulted in the creation of what many of us now know or remember as the food pyramid, which became the gold standard for at least a couple decades, in which fats at the top of this pyramid made up the smallest portion of the diet, and breads and pastas and grains, which are at the bottom of this period, were recommended to make up the bulk of the American diet. Although there were likely good intentions behind recommending that Americans eat a diet that is low in fat, after several decades of this nationwide food experiment, the results have been disastrous. The American population is now more overweight and more obese than ever, and all the health problems associated with that excess body weight has had a very negative impact on our bodies, our overall health, and a tremendous burden on our healthcare system. So let's take a look at the data on what's happened to the rates of obesity in the United States. As you can see on this graph, where that red arrow is pointing to is the time frame of 1980. If we look before that or to the left of that, from 1960 to 1980, we do have a slight increase in the rates of obesity, about a 2 or 3% increase. But then at that time, when the dietary recommendations changed for Americans to be eating primarily a low-fat diet and therefore increasing their carbohydrate intake, the 20 years after, from 1980 to the year 2000, there's actually about a 15% increase. So we compare two 20-year time frames from 1960 to 1980, about a 2 to 3% increase. New dietary recommendations came out. From 1980 to the year 2000, we see basically a doubling, about 15% increase, and we go beyond the year 2000, the percent of people that are diagnosed as being obese just continues to increase beyond that point. Here's another graph. There's actually several graphs of information made available by the CDC from the United States government. Basically shows the same thing in a different format. Here we see across the bottom says 15% in that time frame of 1976 to 1980, which is when the new recommendations came out. We jump forward 20 more years, now we're at 30% and then increasing beyond that. And again, just another way to illustrate that same information. Again, that late 70s to early 80s was a critical changing point or turning point in what was happening with the rates of obesity, where it began to increase dramatically right at the same time frame when the new dietary recommendations came out to be eating low fat and therefore be eating more carbohydrates. So what about our children? Our children are our future. So how does the future health of our children look? So this graph shows for both children and kids in their teenage years, from that time frame of the 1960s to 1980, the rates kind of averaged around 5%. And then from 1980, fast forward to the year 2000, we're looking at a percentage of around 15%. So actually, Within adults, the rates of obesity went from 15 to 30% between 1980 and the year 2000. However, for kids and children, it increased from 5% to 15%. So there's actually a greater percentage of increase that's happened in that same time frame with our teenagers and our kids. And again, beyond the year 2000, it's continued to increase from there. So very, very concerning that the rates of obesity are increasing faster in our children. And even though it's still concerning, it's increasing fast in adults, it's increasing even faster in our children based on these statistics. So let's take a look at this from another perspective on what's happened to the American population by eating a low-fat and higher carbohydrate diet. This is some more data made available by the CDC. And what they've done here, if you look across the bottom, we have different color codings indicating for different colors the percentage of the population within that state that has been diagnosed or would be considered obese. And this recording of data began in 1985, so we have several of them that are the states that are shaded in white, which means we don't have the data on that state yet. But we do see we have several states that fall into that either 10% or that 10 to 14%. So from 1985, let's fast forward now to the year 1990. Now we have just a smaller number of states that we don't have any data. But we have, of the color coding, we have more that are in that 10 to 14% as of 1990. Let's go fast forward another 5 years to 1995. We have the data in on all the states now, and here we have 5 years later about half the states that are now in that next higher kind of darker blue range from 15 to 19%, and the remainder that are in the 10 to 14%. Fast forward again 5 more years to the year 2000. Almost no states, there's only one that's appearing to be in that lower 10 to 14%. We now have about half the states that are showing to be in that 20 to 24%, and the remainder just a little bit lower. 5 more years again from 2000 to 2005. Almost no states are in the blue. In fact, we have some states that are showing, most of them are in that 20 to 30% range. We actually have a few now that are showing to be where greater than 30% of the population of that state is considered to be obese. And then 2010, same thing. We have even more states that are showing to be greater than 30% of their population is considered to be obese. And then this last graph from 2014, the CDC actually changed their color coding a little bit, so you can't do an exact comparison based on coloring, but what we can see is that we now have some states that are showing to be greater than 35%. So there are some states that are in that 35 to 40% of the entire population is considered to be obese, which is very, very significant on the health of those people and on the health of that state. So we see again in that time frame, when we look at the color coding of the states from 1985 here up to 2014, a major change in the number of people that are considered to be obese. So once again, although there were likely good intentions behind recommending that Americans eat a diet that is low in fat, after several decades of this nationwide food experiment, the results have been disastrous. It is time to put an end to this nationwide food experiment and go back to a way of eating that has been consistent with how humans have been evolving for thousands of years into the healthy and intelligent creatures we are meant to be. This means more than just eating foods that are closer to their source or closer to their natural state as intended by nature. It also means a conscious decision to change the ratio of what we are eating. This now brings us to the 30-day food cure. So if you're still not convinced, let's take a closer look at more popular media. Here we saw what I'd shown before, this Time magazine cover from March of 1984 that was sharing with the world that fat is bad. So then let's fast forward almost exactly 30 years later to June of 2014. The new Time magazine cover says, "Eat butter. Scientists labeled fat as the enemy and they were wrong." So quite a contrast in that 30-year time frame. in what I'm also calling that 30-year food experiment. The original thinking was fat was bad, but now we know, based on more recent research, that fat is not the enemy. And in fact, an increased intake of healthy fats can be extremely beneficial to your body and to your diet. So what does this mean? So what this means is that you have been an unknowing participant in what I'm calling the 30-year food experiment. Now the experiment is over, the data is in, and it is now time to change the way you're eating to a strategy that we now know is much healthier for your body. It's what we've learned from this 30-year food experiment that leads us to the recommendations in phase 1 of the 30-day food cure, which is for you to be eating a diet that is much lower in carbohydrates and increasing your intake of healthy fats. But there's still one more thing to consider when deciding which foods you want to be putting into your body. This leads us to phase 2 of the 30-day food cure.